Hi everyone, this is Subeda from Zephyr Lake Carmelite Mission. We are in the second week of Advent, the beginning of the new liturgical year for Christians around the world. And I want to welcome you back to St. John of the Cross's Ascent of Mount Carmel. In my last video, we stopped at chapter 3 in his first book. Today, I'm going to continue from there with chapters 4 and possibly through chapter 10 in his book 1. And you might often wonder, how is this relevant to me? And I've done that myself because, as an example, I've never been through the dark night of the soul. But I think it's important to know, so if it does happen, we recognize the signs and we know what we are experiencing and we will be able to handle it better. And I feel this work of St. John of the Cross is more of a map for spiritual growth. And if we know the map and the direction, I think we will be able to start on the journey and also make the right kind of progress in our journey. So this might be very advanced for most of us, but it is still good to know. So continuing with his reflections, it is most difficult. It's easy for us to give up things, but it's most difficult to give up our love of creatures. Now, we're not talking about the right love for family and friends. We're talking about disordered or inordinate attachment, being too attached to them that it actually is an obstacle to our life of prayer. So St. John of the Cross says that we have to mortify all desires, including the love of creatures, which is, self-denial. And he says that love of creatures is darkness. It gives darkness to the soul, whereas love of God gives us light, and light and darkness cannot coexist. Darkness or love of creatures is a barrier to the union of the soul with God. And a soul that loves creatures will become like them, not like God. And no one is good except God. Even the greatest saint points to God and reflects the goodness of God. So we have to give God, who is the supreme goodness, as our only, fix our attention only on Him, and loving all others for love of God. So no one is good except God. God is supreme goodness, and wisdom and the cunning of this world is ignorance compared to the wisdom of God, which is infinite. Those who employ the wisdom and skills of this world are infinitely distant and separated from God. Set aside worldly wisdom and skills of this world and become like little children, totally dependent on God. Practice littleness, meekness, so God can share His greatness, the great secrets of His kingdom with you. In fact, that is the gospel for today, where Jesus calls the lost sheep as the little ones. Do not despise the little ones, because little ones are the ones who are like children, depending completely on God. Of course, we must love and care and do our duties for our family, friends, and all of God's creation, but it must not become an inordinate attachment, that instead of this love and this friendship and the love of God's creation helping us to increase our love for God, it shouldn't become something that diminishes our virtues and our holiness. It should not become a hindrance, but rather it should help us to increase in holiness. It should not deprive us of our focus on God, but rather it should help us focus better on God. And inordinate attachments deprives us of the necessary detachment that is needed for the union of the soul with God. And continuing on in chapter 5, St. John of the Cross says that a distance of a soul from God is measured by the closeness it maintains with creatures. So that's why often you find the lives of the saints, they would go off into remote places like Jesus did to pray, sometimes for many years. For God is infinitely higher than creatures. To come closer to God, one must give up love of creatures. In order to receive God's Spirit in pure transformation, one must give up all things natural and supernatural. The bread of angels, which is Holy Communion, is distasteful to anyone who desires human food. It is wrong to crave for other foods when God is giving us the heavenly food. This is why the Church recommends specific days for fasting and for abstinence from certain kinds of food, so that in this Christian way of life, we can show by our fasting and abstinence that we are more dependent on the bread of angels rather than on human food. And we must not look for other foods except the food that God gives, which contains everything needed to sustain us and strengthen us for the whole person. Of course, we must eat food for nourishment, for strength, of physical strength, but making the pursuit of temporal and material things as our primary and sometimes our only focus is sinful. That is disordered, and that is, not the proper attitude. Even using sometimes the spiritual imagery for worldly pursuits, those are not correct. So there's in the scripture many, including St. John of the Cross's imagery of their spousal relationship, all that is meant for spiritual pursuit, not for material pursuit. So using it for the wrong purpose is putting food before God. When we desire God and the other, we inadvertently are placing God on an equal level to the other thing we desire. This food or material becomes now an idol, which is we going against the commandments that God gave through Prophet Moses. So in conversing with God, we must leave behind all things, anything that is not purely God. We must eliminate our appetites, strange gods, that is anything we place equal to God, impure things, anything sinful, and our clothes, which is our attachments to things and people. So first, strange gods. How do we put aside strange God? Is having the true God, our Creator, in the center of our heart, mind, and soul, and eliminating all alien affection and attachments. Secondly, how do we eliminate impure things? By purification, purifying our senses through the dark night. And then the third is the new garments of baptism, which replaces the worldly garments for God's garments, which is new knowledge of God, new love for God. These three things are necessary to ascend the Mount of Carmel, the summit where Jesus himself waits for the soul. The soul becomes the altar in which God is praised and adored ceaselessly, continuously. So as I said before, these are guidelines or a map, and we need to know this. If we don't know this, we cannot reach the destination. We cannot even be on the journey. So it is good to know this, even though it may be a little bit too advanced for many of us. Nothing else can dwell together with God. The only things God permits is a desire to fulfill God's laws perfectly and the carrying of the cross daily. Within the ark was placed the laws, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, the rod, which represents the cross on which Jesus was to die, And the third article that was inside the Ark of the Covenant was manna, the food. God himself gives himself as food for our nourishment. And we are the ark, and these are the only things that we should carry within ourselves. That is God, the perfect fulfillment of the law, and carrying our crosses daily. And moving on to chapter 6, these appetites deprive us of God's Spirit and weary, torment, darken, defile, and weaken us. So these are the 5 things we're going to deep dive into in the chapters 6 through 10. 2 contraries cannot coexist in the same will: sensory and spiritual, visible and invisible, temporal and eternal, heavenly food and sensory food, nakedness of Christ and attachment to things of this world. Entirely spiritual Spirit of God cannot enter until the sensory spirit is eliminated. Those with sensory appetites will never be satisfied, will always be bitter, discontent, and hungry. So there is, of course, as human beings, we are supposed to discover, invent new things, explore, but that's not what St. John of the Cross is talking about here. He's talking about inordinate appetites that will never be satisfied because it is focused on the material things, not on the spiritual. It is more difficult for God to empty a person of their appetites and attachments than it is for God to work from nothingness to create a new soul. So in our prayer, we are trying to be like we were at the moment when God created us, at the moment of our baptism. That is what we are aiming for. So the 5 effects of these sensory appetites, which we talked about, the weary, torment, darken, defile, and weaken. These are the 5 things we're going to talk about. First, weary. Appetites are wearisome and tiring. They never satisfy. A person with this appetites, sensory appetites, will always be restless, will never be satisfied. The appetite for things will only get stronger and it will worsen as the soul eats and eats, and it's never satisfied, but it keeps hungering for more, because we know that really the soul is hungering for God. So nothing material is going to satisfy the soul. So that's why the soul that is running after the appetites of this world will always be weary and restless. Second is torment and affliction. Desire for something other than God is an appetite that will torment and cause pain. They are like cords that tie down, that you cannot enslave oneself. He speaks of self-exaltation and fulfillment. And when that doesn't happen, or even if it happens, we want more and more of it. So it torments oneself. The numerous desires, the greater the torment and greater the affliction. They make a person a prisoner of their own making. God has compassion on us and satisfies all our appetites and desires with spiritual and divine food and water. This requires leaving behind creatures and created things and to go to God, who is the source of all goodness, and to listen to him, and he will refresh us, he will satisfy us. Third, blindness and darkness. These sensory appetites cloud a person's intellect and it becomes dark. God's wisdom and natural reason cannot shine in an intellect that is darkened by worldly desires. So a darkened intellect leads to a weak will, a dull memory, and disordered functioning of the intellect. The appetites are light, so close to the person that it blinds the person to the true light, the divine light of reason that is far away. So if we put all these different artificial lights of this world next to us, we can't see the real light of God. The appetites are blind guides that even a person with good sight, if guided by his blind appetites, will become like blind. And exterior penances and exercises are insufficient to bring the soul to union with God if it does not deny these worldly appetites. So if we fast and do all kinds of penance, but we still cling on to these worldly pursuits in a disordered way, we will not experience the union of the soul with God. Appetites are like cataracts in the eye that need to be removed so a person can see clearly in God's wisdom. God will absorb the appetites in this life through sometimes chastisements and corrections, or in our next life through the purification process in purgatory. But nonetheless, in order to reach union with God, we have to go through this purification where these worldly appetites have to be removed from us. These appetites will gradually make us worse if we do not modify them and remove them from our lives. We mistake evil for good and good for evil because of our ignorance. We have a natural darkness or a tendency to do this, and our worldly appetites add to this darkness. Even when we are in the midst of truth and what is suitable for us, we don't see it because we are in the dark. So there is that dissatisfaction because of the worldly appetites that also blinds and darkens the person's intellect, will, and memory. And the fourth one was defiling and staining. So our appetites, St. John of the Cross compares them to like pitch, the dark black pitch, that when we touch it, it stains us. Just like all these worldly desires. Attachments to creatures are like pitch and our soul like pure gold or a bright diamond. Attachment to creatures defiles the soul because the soul becomes like the creature instead of reflecting God's image. The soul's affections and thoughts need to be ordered to the end intended by God, which is God Himself. It is like hair, whiter than snow, clearer than milk, ruddier than ancient ivory, more beautiful than sapphire. So these are from the scripture that St. John of the Cross often uses scripture to do these imageries. And in contrast to a soul that is preoccupied with ends not intended by God, will become blacker than coal. The disordered soul, while it still possesses the natural perfection bestowed by God, but its attachments make it ugly, dark, evil, and abominable. Unless purified, the soul cannot be united with God. And there is a variety of filth in the disordered soul, just like how there is a variety of virtues and gifts in the well-ordered soul. And St. John of the Cross speaks of the vision of prophet Ezekiel in chapter 8, verse 10 to 16, that gives figuratively the abominations found in the soul in the form of unclean animals, reptiles, and crawling creatures, very similar to what St. Teresa of Avila saw in her vision in the interior castle. She saw these creatures, these synths that are trying to creep in to the soul as reptiles and crawling creatures. And here, Prophet Ezekiel also sees women weeping for the God of love and old men with their backs turned on the temple. So this was Ezekiel's vision. These were paintings on the walls, and the three chambers in which these three paintings were there represent the faculties that are darkened. So St. John of the Cross says the first chamber is the intellect, where those creatures are, and then the second is the will, where the women are weeping, and the third is the memory, where the old men have turned their back on the temple, that is, they've turned their back on God and they're focused on material pursuits, on worldly desires. The soul of disorder is unsightly because of its appetites and its attachments to creatures. And then finally, he speaks of the weakness and tepidity. So the last effect that is on a soul that is enslaved by its worldly desires. The soul is weakened by its appetites. Love of God becomes tepid. Virtue is weakened when not practiced with all of one's focus. Virtue united is stronger than when scattered. The soul that is not recollected in the desire for God and the practice of virtue alone will lose its strength and heat. The disordered appetites are constantly craving for more and are like blood-sucking leeches that weakens a soul. So he uses all kinds of very powerful images from the natural and to help us to really inspire us and to motivate us to embark on this journey of detachment from created things and creatures. These appetites eat away at even the already existing good and virtues in the soul. It robs the soul if one does not modify these disordered desires and eventually kill the soul's relationship with God. The soul is unhappy with itself, cold towards neighbors, and slothful and sluggish in the things of God. Fix the appetites and affections purely on God alone. So we must not wait until we are old and gray and we have nothing else to do in our retirement to begin, but we have to begin now. The very fact that you're watching this video means you can begin now. Maybe small steps, it doesn't have to be all at once, but at least this should be on our mind to give attention wholeheartedly and to desire wholeheartedly for God alone. And of course, loving others, but loving them and living only for the glory of God in all that we do, in all that we speak, and in all that we think. So with that, I'd like to end today's reflection, and I want to wish you a happy Advent, and hopefully I can do one more video before Christmas. Have a blessed day, and thank you for watching.